Tu attends quelque chose, Michel?
Hein?
Tu attends quelque chose? Simplement
les règles là-bas. Ah bon, c'est là-bas que ça va se passer?
Non, non, c'est ici, mais c'est la présentation d'abord officielle.
Et après, vous allez...
Après, on arrête pour une minute pour que les gens qui vont parler, que ce soit ici.
Bon, alors, d'accord, on commence. Est-ce qu'on peut commencer? Can we begin?
Okay.
I think our appreciation is due to Professor Serbian not only for his stimulating paper, but for organizing this crucial symposium. Anyone who's ever organized a conference knows what backbreaking work it often involves. I'm sure there are questions after these papers this afternoon. Who would like to start posing them?
Yeah, I guess I'd like to ask Professor Serban if he could perhaps go a little bit beyond his paper to another famine which I believe the Ukraine suffered. Khrushchev speaks about it in his memoirs, and that is the post-war famine of 1945-46. I don't know how much work has been done on that. I just came across it reading the Khrushchev memoirs some years ago. But I gather that Khrushchev claims in the memoirs that he protested against the confiscation of grain, particularly seed grain, from Ukrainian peasants in that period when he was appointed to administer the area, and that there was famine. And I'm curious as to how this compares with 21 and 33, which we've been discussing in this conference, if you feel able to discuss that period at all.
I'm afraid my limited research has been on the famine of 21 and 33, but I think there are people here in the audience who are much more knowledgeable and who have worked on that period of 46, 47. I think of the three, that is the least known in the historical literature. And
we'll save that for another day.
We'll save it for later. Yeah, Mr. Terendik is here. Maybe he could comment on the famine of 46, 47. The question was asked, and I'm afraid I'm not very knowledgeable on that.
I can tell you what I know, which is very little. The evidence indicates that there was a famine in 46, 47. We know little about it because the Ukrainians who are now here in the West left before that time. That famine is confirmed by Khrushchev in his memoirs. He does reveal that a famine took place. I think I can quote him word for word. He says in his memoirs, it happened in the following way. All the grain was expropriated, and exported. There are fragmentary references. There is, for example, a Some Without story by Vasil Simonenko, which treats the famine of 46, 47. There are references in the underground literature published by the UQàM, which was active in Western Ukraine at that time, references to the famine that was taking place. It seems, I'm not certain about this, it seems that that famine was in part due, like the famine of 21-22, was in part due to the disturbances in agriculture caused by the war. But there were also, according to Khrushchev, political factors involved. Export of grain continued even when not enough was being left for people to survive. We don't have any statistics about the losses then. We have very few eyewitness accounts.
Well, while you're gathering your thoughts, perhaps I could pose a general question. We have the concepts provided by Professor Chalk and Johnson at the beginning. I'm just wondering whether there's any famine that's comparable to the one of 1933. What about the Irish potato famine, for example, which was also partly man-made? Or, this is a question I address to everyone, is there any other event that is comparable to the famine of 33?
Cambodia. Not identical, but a comparison can be drawn, I think. would be an instructive comparison, but bring out both similarities and differences, I think.
Would you like to bring them out for us?
Well, in the case of Cambodia, it does seem that here too was a government policy, a two-pronged policy. One was the extermination of the Cambodian intelligentsia, and that term was defined so loosely that anyone who wore eyeglasses was accused of being an intellectual. He obviously had an education and was destroyed. In terms of the percentage, the Cambodians suffered more than the Ukrainians, although their actual absolute losses were probably smaller. But it does seem that half the population of Cambodia was exterminated. And I do wonder whether those Indo-Chinese communists who were in power at the time had not, to a large extent, received their training in Moscow in the 1930s.
Yes.
As far as Cambodia is concerned, the regime which was in power at the time of the genocide, its leaders, if they were trained and inspired, it was China rather than the Soviet Union. It's the present Vietnamese authorities that are rather the present Cambodian authorities who are, so to speak, take pro-Moscow side. But the origins of...
But, excuse me, just for 1 second, if I may interrupt. Their education and training would have come before the Chinese-Soviet split.
From Paris.
Or Paris,
mainly
yes,
Paris.
too.
In the
But
West,
wouldn't
yes.
many of them have been trained in the Soviet Union?
No, apparently the leaders were trained mostly in France. So there is no direct connection with the Soviet Union, and the model of some sort, or at least the patronage, was coming from Peking well after the break between Peking and Moscow.
Yes, Professor Shevlov.
Since nobody speaks about my paper, I will speak about it seems to me, I'm no authority in that, of course, but it seems to me that we have to establish some, how would I say that, some, not hierarchy, but really some specialization, some types, some typology of famines. If I am not mistaken, perhaps I am, very easily so, it seems to me that the famine of 21 was a famine both in countryside and in cities. Now the famine of 33 clearly was a famine in the countryside, but not in the big cities. There were malnutrition, there were many other things, but there were no victims of starvation among the permanent city dwellers. As for the famine of post-war years, I have rather a question. I don't know to whom it should be addressed because nobody spoke about this famine after all. But it seems to me that it may be a direct continuation of the famine which was under the Germans. And that was typically the famine in the cities, but not in the countryside. So it seems to me that you have three types of famines. The entire population, the countryside, and the cities.
Thank you. Yes.
Some work has been done on the typology of famines. There is an American geographer by the name of Dando who has published an article on what he calls 1,000 years of Russian famines. And his argument is that, first of all, almost all famines are political in origin, that famine is not caused by an actual lack of food, but rather by political interference in the distribution of food. He's not terribly well versed in Russian history, but he does make a plausible case that the various famines that have occurred in Ukrainian, which he includes with Russian, in Ukrainian and Russian history, have all been politically motivated. And he ties these famines, he has built charts showing how the location, the geography of these famines is connected with the expansion of Russia. There is also an Indian economist named Sen, who has developed, as I see by the shake of a head here that someone is familiar with this, who has developed a theory of famine based on what he calls entitlement. He believes that famines occur when certain people or certain classes of people, for one reason or another, lose their entitlement to food. And he has developed this theory largely on the basis of famines in India, but the methodology, I think, could well be applied to other famines.
I have a question directed to Professor Chalk or Professor Johnson. When I was planning the conference and trying to organize the panels, one of the problems was where to put your paper. And there were two alternatives. Either put it right in the beginning or right at the end. The advantage of having it right in the beginning is that a theoretical paper would provide a certain theoretical framework for the whole conference for discussion. And then I thought, well, maybe not knowing what type of people would be participating, besides the people on the panel, perhaps it would be better first to begin with a more factual analysis of factual, and then go to theoretical. And that's for that reason I left it at the end. Now, I'm just wondering, my question is, in the light of this conference proceedings and what has come out in the conference, how would you apply your theoretical conclusions to the famine in Ukraine or certain conflict?
Well, I must admit that I didn't really know much about the famine until 2 days ago. So I really haven't had the time to try and integrate it into our framework. There are so many cases throughout history that we've just mentioned a few of them to illustrate our paper, that it's almost impossible to become an expert on each of them. In fact, I didn't say anything before, but I might mention now that while you were raising questions about the famine before, that there were some very large-scale famines associated, again, with Genghis Khan's empire building, because he destroyed not only cities and populations, he also destroyed agriculture. Now, it's one of the cases where it's really difficult to find out much, partly because there are no written records, partly because the Mongols didn't leave any literature at all. So all the evidence comes from the people he subjugated. But we do know that there are large areas of Central Asia, which before the Mongols came along, were extremely fertile, irrigated agricultural land, and which have remained desert to this day. So that presumably some very dramatic things happen, of which we don't know too well the details. But to answer your question more specifically, all I can say is that we'll have to think about the answer.
Professor Serban, in Professor Chalk's presentation, he talked about developing a typology in terms of intent for defining the concept of mass extermination or genocide. If you, within that context, would you qualify the Russians' policy with respect to the famine of 1921 and 33 as genocidal within the context of intent?
I think I'll probably have to pass that one up too. I think there are elements of genocide elements. There are ethnocidal elements in my opinion as well. I think that the famine, especially the second famine, not being only economic, the purpose was not only for economic. It was not only for economic reasons. It was also to break the backbone of Ukrainian national revival. I think that was a fight against the Ukrainian nation. So that, in that sense, I think it was ethnocide.
One danger into which generalizing about this and other famines might fall is perhaps ascribing a single or very few factors to something which might be much more complicated and which might involve unforeseen consequences of actions that were initially planned, had limited objective. There are a great many questions about rationality of Stalinist terror of the 1930s. If it were simply the question of disposing of nationalities, of national communities, national revival in a certain manner, it would seem just too easy, so to speak, too simple to ascribe to it. In Russia, where national revival has assumed less massive proportions in 1920s, there was the parallel purge and liquidation of under the slogans of liquidating not the demotion of National Democrats, the liquidation of the cultural elite, almost parallel process, but without the benefit of the famine. You have, for example, following the liquidation, mass liquidation of churchmen and the churches, you have the purge turning against the League of Militant Godless of Ukraine, with the leadership purge and shut as the Trotskyite, Zinoviev, Bukharin's bandits, saboteurs. You have the great military purge, which, if we are to believe Khrushchev, he implied that much in 1961, has been the result of provocation by Abra, which in turn apparently might have received cooked up evidence via white Russian emigres from NKVD that might have tried to dispose of the high command of the Red Army. But something like 50,000 senior officers were liquidated then. And there were no ethnic considerations in this respect. It was a suicidal thing to do on the part of the Soviets. You have after Yagoda's period in terror, you have the purge of Yagoda and his people, and Yezhovshchina. With the arrival of Beria on the scene, you have the purge of Yezhov and his team. In other words, we do have certain problems with perhaps not admitting that this entire problem is much more complicated and has to be looked at several levels, with at least the admission that there might have been indeed certain unexpected consequences of policies, of actions which somehow have taken their own path and have escaped control at certain stage.
Can I just add something to that? I quoted in the beginning of my paper a man who says the famine, which began as an unforeseen catastrophe, was gradually transferred into a kind of disciplinary institution organized. In other words, it became a policy. A similar point is made, I think, in Fisher's book about the famine of 21. In other words, he says that the authorities were not adverse to using this as a policy in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians had given them too much trouble, in the peasantry especially, and so on. So when we talk about the man-made famine, I don't think we have to think in terms of premeditated in the sense of people sitting down in the Kremlin a couple of years ahead of time and planning out the famine. The thing is, when it does take place for various reasons, because of the policies and economic policy, agricultural, and so on, what do? I think in that sense, it has to be considered as man-made. In other words, if you do have the wheat in the country and you still allow the people to starve, that I think then it does become a man-made. That's one thing. Another thing is, another point that I have to make is the mentalities and the survival of mentality or certain climate from generation to generation and from regime to regime. I think traditionally Ukraine was considered as a sort of a colony. Russia, that was the mentality of the Russian authorities against towards Ukraine. And I think by reading documents from that period and so on, you can see very easily that that mentality had not disappeared. It was still, I mean, if you have to sacrifice somebody, it's easier to sacrifice the peasants in Ukraine and Kherson than the peasants in Volga. So you take the wheat from the starving peasants in Kherson and you send it to the starving peasants in the Volga. Let's face it, there is a certain, I think, a certain reluctance among Ukrainian scholars to study the famine, as well as non-Ukrainian scholars. I mean, today we have, I think, one person who is really doing work, at least of the younger generation, who is doing research on the famine, one Ukrainian and one non-Ukrainian. And this is more specifically on the famine of 33. Of course, studying in depth the famine of 33, they're much more knowledgeable because they have done research on other famines as well. But how many Ukrainian scholars, or non-Ukrainian scholars, any scholars in the West, have delved into this problem of famines in Ukraine?
And yourself?
I think Mr. Tsalin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Regrettably, ladies and gentlemen, I'm not a scholar or an academic. I'm a criminal lawyer. And in criminal law, there is a law of murder. And for the law of murder in Canada, the highest crime is first-degree murder, for which the Crown has to prove planning and deliberation. How do we prove planning and deliberation? I've done a number of murder trials in Canada. There is never any evidence, or rarely direct evidence, of planning and deliberation. Ordinarily, the evidence that is adduced in a criminal trial involves pieces of evidence, fragmentary evidence, the type of evidence to which Mr. Tsarinnik referred last night. That is, the exclusion of the press, basically blotting out the public access to an area. Inferences can be drawn from proven facts. In criminal law, there are two ways to prove a fact: direct evidence and circumstantial evidence. And the circumstantial evidence rule is as valid as the direct evidence. I can witness a crime and I can say, I saw it. I saw this man pull a gun and shoot the chairman. God forbid that should happen. But as the chairman, that is direct evidence. The chairman has been shot by this gentleman. The indirect evidence rule, the circumstantial evidence rule, involves this gentleman running out of this room with a gun and the chairman lying there. Another rule of circumstantial evidence is, if you're sitting in your office and someone comes in with an umbrella and there is water on the umbrella, you can assume that it's raining. Now, maybe it's not raining. Maybe a water truck sprayed this person's umbrella. So we draw inferences. And ordinary people, juries, in a Canadian system, in the Anglo-Saxon system of justice, we have juries, members of the public, that will look at evidence, and they will say, this is murder. And ladies and gentlemen, this is murder. This is not famine. Ukrainians call things, because we are basically lovers and Christians, we call everything in a very nice way. This is murder, and it's mass murder via famine. If a person were to come here and shoot someone with a gun, that's first-degree murder, if I can prove planning and deliberation. If I lock this man in a room and I don't give him any food for a month and he dies, that's first-degree murder. There's no difference. The vehicle is different. If I take this man and drive out to the Arctic Circle and throw him out in 50-degree weather, minus 50 degree, and he dies of exposure, that's murder. In my view, this is the entire focal point of this conference. I think our Jewish brethren have been able to prove murder, and very satisfactorily, perhaps because the Germans were able to leave evidence. The master criminal does not leave evidence. People that commit murder don't leave fingerprints, they wear gloves. I had a first-degree murder case in Toronto. The man wore gloves during the murder. The jury convicted of first-degree murder. They draw inferences from proven facts. The Crown calls a pathologist to decide how the person died and then the cause of death. The problem with academics is that you are unable to draw the obvious inference. If there was a jury sitting here, listening to the fragmentary evidence of what has been proven here and here and here, they would say, collectively, this is murder. Academics are afraid to use words like this. Why? Are you afraid of the Soviet Union? You're in the West. Are we all sort of willing to call the Nazi Holocaust by the name that it has been called? Murder, a crime against humanity, a crime against all of us. whether Jew or non-Jew. This was a crime against all of us. Why is the Ukrainian mass murder on any different plateau? This was mass murder, as the previous speaker said. If you look at the isolated area of Ukraine where this happened, if we were to take a map and draw a circle of where it happened, and if we were to have all these proven facts, we would say, I don't care whether we do have access or not to the Kremlin and to the documents of the Kremlin. That is irrelevant. In a court of law, there is rarely, if any, evidence of first-degree murder. You prove a case through the drawing of inferences, what I've referred to as circumstantial evidence. And I think that conferences of this kind should also focus in on the legal aspect, the international law aspect. No one is going to go to the Kremlin and arrest people because Mr. Andropov has missiles and soldiers and troops and more tanks than we have, evidently. But we can still censure this conduct. I think I was impressed with the speaker who spoke about genocide and ethnocide. But even that speaker has perpetrated, in my respectful view, a misaccuracy. He has given us inaccurate facts. He mentioned the slaughter of the peasants, Russian peasants by Stalin. They were not Russian peasants. They were Ukrainian peasants. Let's get those facts straight. It is Ukrainians that died. There were no Russians in Moscow that died. So this is the problem with the academics. You want to incontrovertible evidence. Nothing can ever be proven to a mathematical certainty. In a courtroom, and even in Nuremberg, I don't know, or even in the case of Adolf Eichmann, people who have committed atrocities, crimes against humanity, mass murders, are the worst criminals in the history of mankind. We prosecute, in a civilized country, we prosecute people for killing one person. Mr. Olson from British Columbia has committed 11 killings, and we say mass murder, and we're appalled. The Ukrainian mass murderers committed 6 million murders, and we are calling this a famine. Those are my comments.
On one hand, I think Professor Butsuiki has provided a very valuable corrective. There is a great danger in attributing single-mindedness and rationality to Soviet policies. There is a great danger in reducing a phenomenon as vast as the famine, which was in effect a war, reducing it to a single cause, in being, as the historian's jargon has it, monocausationalist. On the other hand, I think it would be very valuable to look at the way the Irish famine of the 1840s is treated in historiography. The immediate cause of that famine was natural, a blight that struck the potato crop. And since the Irish peasant was dependent almost exclusively on the potato, he starved to death. So there is no question of attributing the planning of that famine to the British government. Yet, historians who have studied the Irish famine have concluded that British public and government policies towards Ireland and towards the Irish victims of the famine were so inconsistent that a large share of the responsibility for that famine must be assumed by Britain. Thank you.
First, on the Irish business, which I mentioned earlier, if you're dealing with mentalities, which Professor Serban mentioned earlier, there is, of course, no doubt that the British government at the time was guilty. All you have to do is go back to Cromwell's time. You may recall that Cromwell was very tolerant, one would say progressive in questions of religion, in treating minorities, but when it came to treating the Irish, he regarded them as beasts and worthy of being savagely killed and hunted down like animals. So here you have the difficulty in approaching, let's say, a man like Cromwell, on the one hand, progressive, highly advanced, on the other, really, he left a blot in English history which is probably will never be rubbed out. This sort of approach, I dare say, may also be used in the Soviet case. The Soviet government, after all, prided itself on its progressive policies vis-à-vis the nationalities after the revolution, and then we saw from Professor Shevilov's paper how that then completely changed. To come to the legal question you mentioned, I think, in defense of my academic colleagues, I should say that it is much easier dealing with the evidence left behind by the Third Reich for one very simple question, for one very simple reason. The documents were captured after the collapse of the Third Reich. In the case of the Soviet Union, we don't have that kind of evidence. We have the evidence of some people who got away, the testimony of eyewitnesses, which we heard today, but we don't have the kind of massive evidence, except in a few accidental cases. I will draw your attention, for instance, to the study by Noel Feinsod at Harvard. This was based on the evidence captured from the Germans, which gave us insight into the way the NKVD conducted its activities, which, as it turned out, in arresting populations, was not so different from that of the Gestapo. There is a similar study by Alexander Dalin, based on talking to displaced people after the Second World War. But when you're dealing with something that was so internal as 1933, the Ukrainian famine, scholars have simply not have had the evidence. So I think it's only fair to them to point out that this neglect has not been due to mauvaise volonté, it's been due largely to the fact that it's very, very hard to get at. No,
yes, I just wanted to say a word. I'm very glad that Mr. Trump mentioned this point, brought out this point, but I would like to return the ball into his own court. This is an academic session. It was planned as such, and the purpose is to analyze, first of all, to establish or help establish the fact of the famine. Like I mentioned yesterday, I still think that to many people, both in the academia and outside, the famine of 1933 is not an established historical fact. And then the second point was that we were going to try to define, analyze this historical fact, because for most of us this is an established fact. But that was the purpose, that was a limited purpose. There certainly is place for people who are in law to raise this thing, and I wish that somebody would, and perhaps you or your colleagues, and I think this is a challenge to you people. Yes, go ahead, do this. I'm sure that the Jewish academics were not the ones that were running after the war criminals. It was somebody else, and it probably was the Jewish lawyers, or the lawyers who were concerned with the Jewish Holocaust that did this. I don't think it was primarily the academics.
I don't think Telford Taylor is Jewish,
pardon?
actually.
No, he's not.
Well, I said, okay, that's why I corrected myself, people who are interested in that. But I think this is, I wish some lawyers would take this case up and see what can be done. You can perhaps draw on the material that will be gathered by our academic people, Professor Mace or Zorianna and so on. But the ball is in your court on this score.
Well, I would just very briefly respond, if I might, Mr. Chairman, that the conference, if the limited purpose is established, that de facto this, what I call mass murder via famine, occurred, then I think that's been authenticated quite some time ago, and perhaps this is a refresher, a reminder to refresh people's memories. So that might be one matter. But if you just isolate it and say, yes, it happened, so what? There is a famine in Biafra. There's a famine caused by a drought in South Yemen or in some part of the Sahara. That's one matter. The very critical point, and the missing link, the really critical thing for Canadians, for any freedom-loving persons, for anyone who believes in faith and justice, and indeed, the professors have to pursue the truth. I think you as professors, you are the ambassadors of the truth, not just the lawyers. Now, the truth is that this mass murder in Ukraine was intentionally, deliberately carried out by Stalin and the Bolshevik Party. This was an intentional genocide on our people, the Ukrainian people. And you're saying, well, the pieces of the puzzle are there, and everybody could easily draw that inference. But the academics say, well, the pieces of the puzzle are there, but yes, it sort of happened. So what? I say accountability is important, because if our Jewish brothers had been massacred and murdered as they were, and if there would have been no Nuremberg, and if we didn't even have these extraditions from Canada as we recently had, then there would be a grave injustice. We would have criminals living in our midst. And there are criminals that murdered Ukrainians that are in positions of power and authority, and they should be pursued as well. I'm not saying that we should go and arrest them, but we should certainly try to identify them and say who is responsible, because this was not an act of God, this was not caused by a drought, this was caused by criminals. Nazi war criminals, Bolshevik criminals that were responsible for mass murder. And I think again, the wishy-washy academic approach, well, we're only going halfway. If you're doing it, do it, baby.
This time I think
this and you're back and forth.
What I would like to know is this the first in a series of conferences? And the reason that I ask is that, as was mentioned last night, Orwell was quoted in general in these words, that he was surprised that huge events of the magnitude of the famine had actually escaped the notice of reporters and newspaper files. And if there are going to be further conferences, I wonder if thought would be given to having them either in Ottawa or in Washington. Next year is 1984.
Thank you very much. Professor Servan, would you like to answer that?
I think there are actually plans to have conferences and other commemorative events on the famine. Probably some people here from the media and so on are probably, or Ukrainian media are probably better informed than myself of what is planned. As far as the follow-up to this conference, the only thing that is planned as a follow-up to this conference is to publish the proceedings of the conference in the form of a book, or if, well, or some form anyway, and we do hope to get this done this year. It was a very limited objective. This conference sort of grew. It started as a mini conference with about 4 or 5 speakers from Montreal, and sort of mushroomed. And at some point, I must say that even though it seemed like it was getting out of hand. So we didn't plan much further than that.
If there are, I think it would be very interesting to have a legal viewpoint, as Mr. Trump mentioned.
Well, here again, I think that the academics are not the competent body to do this work. I think we have lawyers for that, and I don't think we should confuse the two. The lawyers should go about it. Another thing is, people can be concerned in establishing the fact of the famine, but some people might not necessarily be concerned in pursuing the consequences of that. There are symposium on all sorts of academic topics, and they're treated as academic topics. And there's no follow-up to that other than publication of the proceedings and so on. I think this is the job of lawyers.
I think there's time for just 2 more questions.
One, I'd like to congratulate all the participants, those who have observed in silence, those who have participated. You have achieved your objectives more than what you expected, certainly more than what I expected, and certainly much more than what the Ukrainian citizens who may be listening to this through Radio Canada International expected. It was a good, effective, very good deliberative discussion and conference, and it's very timely. Now, I can suggest, I can ask, I can tell, or I can instruct as to where we go from here on the agenda, resolve the problem that the gentleman identified as a problem, explain the defense of this community, and the next step is this. We do continue, because it is most important to continue to discuss the issue of food, the absence of food, and the overproduction of food. And so that we don't get into a mess with our Russian and American colleagues on food, I'll just correct some of the potential misunderstandings. The Russians have a legitimate right in criticizing the American and North American capitalist system on the abundance and the gluttony of food. And the Americans and the Western democratic countries have a legitimate right in criticizing the history of inadequacy of foods in the Eastern European countries. Now, the objective of this conference is to bring both of those criticisms together in a common forum, bring together the doctors who will give us their expert opinions upon the various biological definitions of abstinence of food, why it comes about, what are the medical consequences, equally to the lawyer's point of view, and also the accountant and many other professions. There are many different cities which should be candidates to have this kind of conference. And in North America or outside of North America, and I would suggest to the citizens here and the citizens in those other cities, you go back, and if this is important for you, you do your work, you put in your claim. There will be no problem with funds on this, because there is a need for the public to be educated on this subject matter, and the Ukrainian people are to be more than congratulated for taking the initiative, potentially out of fear of embarrassment of their own past, as I heard last night, potentially out of fear of possibly neglect from a non-responsive society, but you already have answered both of those fears very well. Take this issue, and I'm offering it to you to make yourselves the center of the issue, expand it, open up the agenda for some future conferences, and let's get at this issue of food, the presence and the absence of it, and how we deal with it. Bring in the clergy, fasting in various religions. There are all kinds of good imaginative ideas that lend itself to this, and I would encourage you strongly to look optimistically in doing this very well in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be appropriate for Professor Servin to respond to that in conclusion.
Well, I think I'll just draw a general conclusion on my own part about the conference and then thank the people who participated. Je pense que le colloque était, quant à moi, était un succès. Comme je mentionnais tout à l'heure, je pense que la famine, en tant que fait historique, n'est pas encore complètement établie. Et je pense que le colloque a contribué à rendre ce fait historique connu et accepté. Je pense que nous avons aussi contribué à nous avons jeté un peu de lumière, un peu de plus de lumière sur les différents aspects de la famine, les conséquences de la famine, les implications de la famine. Nous l'avons placé aussi dans un contexte plus général. Nous n'avons pas parlé uniquement de la famine, nous avons parlé des autres, nous avons parlé du régime, nous avons parlé de l'ukrainisation, de l'aspect culturel, national, etc., du peuple ukrainien qui avait souffert de cette famine. J'ai mentionné aussi qu'un des objectifs de ce colloque était de publier les actes du colloque et on espère de sortir ça le plus tôt possible, possiblement cette année. Il me reste enfin à remercier d'abord le Centre interuniversitaire d'études européennes qui a bien accepté d'accueillir ce colloque, surtout M. Grenon, le directeur du centre, et aussi Madame Odile Civitello, le secrétaire, qui nous avait aussi aidé beaucoup. C'est l'Université du Québec à Montréal, avec Concordia, et le Centre des études ukrainiennes à Alberta, qui ont financé ce colloque. Je voudrais remercier les participants actifs, d'abord ceux qui ont présenté des communications, et ensuite tout le monde qui est venu à ce colloque et qui a participé dans les discussions. Nous avons, je pense, eu des bonnes discussions, et même si les opinions étaient partagées, mais c'est tout à fait normal, et je pense que c'est dans les controverses de ce genre qu'on trouve la vérité. I would like to thank particularly the people who helped this symposium be known to the general public. And here, the person who did really the most work is, and I can't not mention her, is Zorianna Hrycenko-Luhova, who really is responsible for all the publicity, especially in the beginning in the Anglophone media. And it was thanks to her efforts that the media was so responsive and there was so much about this event on television and in the press. She was also responsible for organizing the display of documents on the famine at the McGill University Library. I do hope that you people in maybe in a year or so will forget about the lights that were bothering us these 2 days, but will at least be happy that the proceedings of this meeting will not be completely forgotten. So thank you very much, and I hope that the question of the famine will now receive its proper place in history.